So, the sacraments of the church are like the veins of a body. They're giving the life of Christ.
What do you think the Cardinals were thinking in terms of their choice of Pope Leo? I'm Emma Trimble, and this is GBN Originals. So we have just seen the historic election of Pope Leo XIV, and I'm very happy to say that we are joined by the UK Programmes Director of Word on Fire, one of my favourite podcasts, I might add, Brenden Thompson. Thank you so much, Brenden, for joining us to talk about the Pope. So let's start off maybe by talking a little bit about his name, because there is a lot in a name, isn't there, when it comes to popes. It tells us a lot about how they imagine their papacy going forward.
Yeah, so the Pope is called Leo XIV, so it immediately brings to mind Leo XIII, a kind of enormous figure, a kind of titan of the late 19th century. This is somebody who is known to be very solid on teaching, but also solid in terms of his outreach to the poor. Particularly, he wrote this document in the late 19th century called Rerum Novarum, which was all about the dignity of the workers, particularly as they were suffering at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I think the name is a way of indicating that if Leo XIII, can rightly be taken up by the right and the left, I think there's something of a bridge building kind of signal being sent. So one of the Latin titles of the Pope is Pontifex, which means a bridge builder. So I think in many ways, Pope Francis, some people loved his pontificate, some people hated it. A lot of people in a mixture of that. So I think in a way he's trying to signal something of that he will continue this legacy of fighting on the front of social justice, but also as well like something of an administrator, and bringing something of his intellect to this as well. He has a doctorate in canon law, is known to be really central in the Curia. He was responsible for selecting the bishops of the world. He was the head of that department. So he brings a lot of kind of skills and energy, and he's young. He's 69, which is young in cardinal years. And he's only been a cardinal since 2023. So I think this will be a long papacy. And yeah, we're very excited to see what that entails.
I think it was Cardinal Dolan who, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was him who said that in looking at the ideal qualities of who the next Pope would be, that hopefully they would have some of Pope Benedict's intellect and sort of is the intellectual heavyweight that he was, alongside the big heart of Francis. Do you think that balance is actually met quite well in Pope Leo?
I don't know, it remains to be seen. Certainly those who know him say he's good-natured, good-humoured, he's a hard worker. He's trying to, in his role as bishop, hasn't taken many controversial stances, so people are looking through, kind of trying to piece together the jigsaw of, what's this guy's priorities. But certainly we know he mentioned Pope Francis in his opening address from the balcony in his blessing, and again in his homily today at the Mass in the Sistine Chapel. So clearly nodding back and, to something of the priorities of Francis. Just like Francis, he was part of a religious order. So Francis was a Jesuit, and Pope Leo was an Augustinian, so founded by St. Augustine. So he brings something of that missionary heart to it. He spent a third of his life in Peru, so he's a naturalized citizen of Peru, as well as obviously having been born in America. So I think he's bringing something of that which signals to people, yes, we are continuing many of the legacies, synodality, concern for the poor, the environment. I expect that we'll see lots of that there. But something of his background as a canon lawyer, I think, will come into the fore as well, and his experience within the Vatican, so seen as a competent administrator, which with the many issues that the church has to deal with internally, I think will be really important.
I've seen a lot of commentators talking about the fact that he is an Augustinian, focusing mostly on you might say the sort of positive aspect of Augustinianism. I'm not to suggest that what I'm about to say is negative anyway, but Augustinians are also associated with realism, with a very realistic understanding of human beings as fallible and sinful, very anti-utopian in approach. So should we expect that to play itself out in terms of, him talking about being bridge builders? There were some concerns, people talking online about, the chances of a large or a small schism depending on who became Pope. Should we be expecting him to sort of heal that rift between the left and the right in the church?
Yeah, that's certainly the prayer, I think, of lots of Catholics. So his episcopal motto, so the motto he took on becoming a bishop, was from one of the homilies of St. Augustine, and in English it is, "In the one Christ we are one." So you see already something of that kind of bridge building, even within the choice of the motto that is now the motto of the papacy. I think also something of that the church gets devolved. It gets too if the church gets too self-referential, then it can lead to all of these arguments. I think the hope is that he puts the church again on a more missional footing. So, it's good and important to talk about, some of these issues, that are important, particularly, let's say, we want him to be strong on on financial, on the financial element of the church. We want to be against corruption and the clerical abuse crisis. But, he's the evangelizer in chief. We want him to do as St. Augustine did. And as you were saying, that, we're fallen but redeemable. St. Augustine's line, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. So something of knowing that the human heart is made for this. And in a world where people are increasingly, feel existential angst, lots of depression, lots of anxiety, a sense of purposeless, I think that there is something that really Christianity can do here. And I hope that this is what the Pope is signalling in lots of the early signs that we're seeing.
And it really was quite incredible to see the number of people, and people literally running towards the Vatican when that white smoke came out of the chimney, and people, very, very emotional, as you would expect, but just to see so many Christians gathered in one place at such an historic moment, I think surely that should have some kind of evangelizing effect. We're already seeing here in the UK that an uptick in the number of young people converting to Catholicism. It seems to be a trend around the world. One thing I noticed, it was very obvious to me when he walked out, and everybody's obviously sitting there at home. It's really the first social media conclave. Everyone's sitting at home anxiously waiting to see who the Pope is going to be. And then out walks somebody who many people, including myself, thought, who is this? I have no idea who this man is. Do you think that actually that could be a benefit to him in terms of his evangelism, that he doesn't have this baggage, he doesn't have, the same associations as maybe Cardinal Parolin or some of the more sort of progressive candidates might have had? Do you think that that could actually, not just him as a person, but also just the spectacle of so many people gathered around, and the obvious life that Catholicism has, might actually create more of a tidal wave of people returning to the faith?
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private Internet Access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com facebook.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
Yeah, please God, that would be amazing. I remember a friend of mine who's now a priest had said that growing up, he remembered, I think in 2005 when Pope John Paul II died, and that this really affected his father watching the funeral of Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II, and said that he converted. He'd been married to an Irish Catholic woman, but, nothing had ever moved him. It was waiting for that kind of outpouring of grace or something, just something to shift in his heart. And it was this papal funeral of all things that was just an occasion of grace. And I already receiving texts from people who, throughout this process, having reflected on the death of Pope Francis, and then, something of the majesty, I think, of all of this, this deep tradition and ritual that's been symbolized and that we've seen all in these days all over our screens. I think that will be an occasion of grace. I think we'll show people this is something that speaks to or points to a world beyond itself. And I think that's what, the Vatican liturgies do really, really well. So I think if you ever go, it's awe-inspiring. I mean, you see like the iconic imagery of the Sistine Chapel, with kind of Michelangelo's Last Judgment there. And, just watching the Mass this morning, I just thought, it made my soul sing. I think, religion is done poorly when it kind of keeps you grounded on the earth. But when you have something like that speaks to your heart and makes you know that you're made for more, I think it keys into what we were talking about, that kind of Augustinian sense, like, yes, I'm, this is religion that tells me I'm made for more. And I think lots of young people are connecting with this as we, hear from the various, data and reports that are coming out. So hopefully this continues that, what I see as a kind of the tide changing.
Yeah, I wonder if there'll be a spike in sales of Rerum Novarum. But it's an interesting aspect of those young people who are turning towards Catholicism is an interest in traditional liturgy. And of course, Francis was very much not keen on the traditional Latin Mass. And I think some young people really hope that this Pope will have a slightly more generous attitude towards traditional forms of worship. Is that something that you think would benefit the Catholic Church in terms of evangelism?
Yeah, I definitely do. In fairness to Pope Francis, one of the things you noticed if you watched him at Mass is like, yes, he's found very gregarious and outgoing and very humorous, when he's meeting people. But whenever he was celebrating the Holy Mass, he was incredibly intense and serious. And there are stories of people who went into his private chapel in Santa Marta's, and, if they were, like sitting down or not sitting down where they were meant to be, he would tell them off. And, this is the Mass type thing. So he had an incredible love for the Mass. So let's not give the impression that he didn't. But he saw a problem with, I guess, some of the abuses or the ways that the traditional Latin Mass was being used in different ways. I would regard that it solved a real problem, his reforms, but it was almost like a sledgehammer on a nail. Like, I think it was overkill. So I would be delighted to see those restrictions lifted and to go back closer to something like what Benedict XVI had with Summorum Pontificum, kind of much more like kind of laissez-faire to allow, the job of the Pope is almost, it's been compared to like a referee in a game. He makes these crucial decisions to allow play to continue. So I think, the Pope Francis knew things I don't know, so that's my own assessment, but I may well be wrong, and I defer to the judgment of the Church on that. But if I'm talking personally, I'd like to see some of that lifted and relaxed if that's what the new Pope thinks, because I can see in my own life, but also in the life of others, as you say, something of the beauty of this, of this rite. And as Benedict XVI had said before, what we have considered holy for centuries, we can't just suddenly think is not, worthy of consideration or worthy of weight, or is somehow wrong. So yeah, finding the proper place and how Pope Leo will do that in a delicate way will be interesting to observe.
Well, some people also pointed out that he also the way that he was dressed was quite different from the way that Francis presents himself, a bit more traditional, a bit more ostentatious isn't quite the right word. But I do think a lot of people seeing the footage, and as you say, people feeling moved by this, people potentially being converted by this, that even witnessing it through a screen, it felt like some great civilizational and historical moment that for me was only really comparable to the death of the Queen. Do you think that actually for Catholicism and Christianity in general, that the beauty of the traditions, the beauty of the liturgy has a big role to play in evangelism, but I mean in the sense of, you know, the connection between beauty and truth, that isn't something that people see in the rest of their lives, and to see this sort of almost drop from heaven in this historical moment, that there seems to be this sort of transcendent aspect to it.
Yeah, so of course the liturgy has a central role in that, not because of how beautiful the ornaments that are used in a mass are, as important as that is actually, because I think it reverences the mystery that it's signaling, right? But the reason it's important is because this is the means that Jesus has given the church to connect with him. So, you know, the sacraments of the church are like the veins of a body. You know, they're giving the life of Christ, through these are the means that he's given us, these visible means to reach his, or to be connected into invisible life of grace. So I think it's incredibly important. Like, I think there is something genius. I've always thought there's something genius about the way that the church has used signs, symbols, sacramentals, rituals in order to help us to connect into mysteries that are hard to fathom and hard to grasp. So yeah, so I think we should have an attitude of saying, like, yes, more of this, and but for those things not to become a source of distraction. To the degree that these things lead us to the mystery that they're representing, then more of that.
Like I mentioned already, you know, many people wouldn't necessarily have recognized him when he walked out onto the balcony, and he was certainly not one of those who, you know, was considered a front runner. He probably went into the conclave not expecting at all. Apparently he even made some comments to, I think it was his brother, implying that he didn't think that this was really a possibility. So what do you think was the reasoning behind, if you can speculate, the choice, given that there were so many other candidates who people quite literally put their money on? What do you think the Cardinals were thinking in terms of their choice of Pope Leo?
Yeah. So I think Cardinal Prevost's odds at the bookies apparently were like 50-1. Now, why would they have been 50-1? I think there were basically, the common consensus was 3 strikes against his name. He's quite young, 69. So if he lives to the age of Pope Francis, we can expect a kind of 18, 19-year pontificate. So it's quite a long pontificate. The second is that he's American. You know, in a way, there was like the biggest strike against his name. That was seen America as a global superpower. You know, we wouldn't want to concentrate that much power, the power of the papacy. And the third reason, he was only recently made a cardinal. So he was only made a cardinal in 2023. So all of those things were kind of strikes against his name. So why? And we know that he was elected in the 4th ballot, which means that the Cardinals got to a consensus relatively quickly. We didn't expect anything on the first vote, neither on the second. But then when you get into the kind of 3rd, 4th vote, then probably there's a coalescing. So it means that they got to that relatively quickly. I think because he was the head of the dicastery, or the department for bishops. So he was involved in selecting bishops all across the world. So he'd been well known. And I think in that, lots of people said that he was a competent administrator. I also think they would have selected him because there's that sense for many of the cardinals of saying, we want to retain something of the missionary dynamism. So even critics of Francis would have said, yes, the church, of course, needs to have a missionary footing and be, you know, the preeminently evangelistic. And so something of the missionary credentials or qualifications of Cardinal Prevost would have made him, you know, kind of perfect. His life, his CV is a kind of testament to wanting to be a church on mission, and also those kind of social justice priorities of service of the poor and of the environment, and all those things that became hallmarks of Pope Francis's pontificate. So I think he's a safe pair of hands, steady pair of hands, seen as a moderate candidate. So that probably indicates why it was chosen so quickly.
And like you say, his pontificate is likely to be very, very long. We're at what feels like the beginning, at least, of an extremely pivotal volatile time in world history. Obviously, that's something that is far too complicated to speculate about with any accuracy. But what do you expect from his time as Pope in terms of world affairs, in terms of the global church?
One of the things I love about the Pope is not only is he meant to be a principle and source of unity for Catholics, but he's meant to embody holiness on the world stage. So my only expectations or hope for the Pope is that he's holy. Just because somebody is the Pope doesn't automatically mean they're holy. We see lots of counterexamples in the history of the church. So we must pray for him. But I want him to be a kind of radiant witness. So as he is, doing one of the things that the Pope does, meeting with world leaders, so he'll likely give addresses at the UN, at various parliaments. He'll go out and go on apostolic visits all around the world. I want him to be a kind of dynamic, invitational witness to a life that's been transformed by knowing Jesus risen from the dead, and to just, to be someone who proclaims that with their word and with their witness. All of everything else is secondary. He's ultimately a kind of witness to the proclamation of Jesus risen from the dead. That's ultimately what I want from him, and that his life and his words show it in all the ways. And then I want him to lead the Vatican in being this kind of an instrument of peace in the world. There's so much, division and violence, lots on social media, within the family, within cultures, things that are tearing us apart. So to be that kind of bridge building figure, because I think when the peace of Christ comes, it's a peace that the world, can't bring itself. There's something of that peace of Christ that needs to bring people together. So I hope that the Pope has that role, that something of his leadership can help the church be a more effective witness and instrument of the peace of Christ in the world.
As you mentioned as well, he's an American nobody expected. An American born in Chicago, though he spent a lot of time in Peru, in Latin America. In terms of, we've already mentioned that he is an Augustinian. In terms of his relationship with the United States, that was quite strained, it seemed, under Francis. Of course, J.D. Vance was one of the last people that the Pope met with publicly. He's been quite critical, it seems, that people immediately jumped onto Twitter, the first Pope with a Twitter history, and saw that he'd retweeted a criticism particularly of J.D. Vance's comments about Order and Morris. Maybe you could explain a little bit about what that actually means, and what we might take as a conclusion from this criticism, whether or not, his relationship with the United States might be a bit tricky off the back of this, perhaps what this tells us about his theology.
There's been a fascinating debate, a few months old now, of bringing Christian theology right into the center of kind of global politics, of saying, as we think about the loves and the order of love, so Order Amoris, order of loves, like the argument was, and is coming from the teaching of Thomas Aquinas, that says, in some regards, you have to, if there's no other emergencies in an ordinary sense of thinking, you need to love your family first, or those who are immediately in your sphere of influence, and then in degrees you're able to love others. If there's an emergency, somebody is in desperate need, then of course you can kind of circumnavigate the Ordo Amoris. And of course, it's one of those ideas. It's it's not official church teaching, and I think lots of people have entered into that debate, and I think that's fine. I think the history of the church shows that you can have robust debates. It's a family in which there's arguments and different interpretations. So Pope Francis, in his letter to the Americas, very much went against a particular interpretation of the Ordo Amoris, saying, like, well, the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, tells us that we should, in fact, suspend some of those things when we see people in need. But so I think he saw maybe J.D. Vance's interpretation of it, or at least a way of representing it, as deficient, as lacking that kind of subtlety. So look, I'm not a moral theologian, so I think just to say that there are lots of different opinions on this, I think suffices. But it doesn't surprise me that somebody like Robert Prevost would advocate on behalf of migrants and the poor, and whether he's done that tactfully in the right way, I don't know. It's for other people to decide. But as a Catholic, you want to be seeing the Pope advocating on behalf of the marginalized, migrants, talking about peace. That's just what Catholics do. That's just what Jesus did. So, people will argue about whether that was done in the correct way or, and I think the debate is fine, have the debate. So, so it signals something of, I think, that there will be tensions. So President Trump has already given his congratulations and is clearly delighted that for the first Pope from the United States. But I think that we can, be sure to see some fireworks in the future.
And is your own Bishop Bob, also an American Bob, is he? I've seen him doing the rounds on social media and clips, and has been doing a lot of interviews. He seems very pleased.
Yeah, well, it's because it's another Bob from Chicago, Pope Leo. So he'd met Cardinal Prevost a number of times at the synodality that was convened by Pope Francis, so the kind of last 2 Octobers. And his assessment is that, he is really kind, humble, humorous, intelligent man. He's got a doctorate in canon law. And it's a special grace for the American people, but for all of us who are native speakers of English. So listening to him say, when he began his homily this morning in the Mass in the Sistine Chapel, he first said, "May I speak in English first for a moment?" And so he spoke in a moment first. So it's the first time we've heard him publicly since being Pope speak English. And I must admit there was a kind of cognitive dissonance in my mind. It was bizarre to hear the Pope speaking in kind of perfect English. So, what a grace. And I think Bishop Barron would just be, as someone, what a grace that he comes from not only Chicago. So we have our Word on Fire offices in Chicago, and they all celebrated by having, deep dish Chicago pizza in honor of the Pope. And, just thought how bizarre and wonderful that the Pope, grew up on these streets. It gives this sense of, somebody who's looking after the spiritual care of 1.4 billion Catholics could come from down the road from me. I think the Pope can sometimes feel like such a distant figure that to think, no, he grew up in a place like, in a road like mine, in a neighborhood like mine, had friends, had two siblings. It makes this person of the Pope, which can seem very removed, really real.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how humble he is. I saw an interview where the interviewer was asking somebody who was in touch with him, what he was like. And he said he plays tennis and he replies to texts very quickly. And the journalist said, well, can you ask him, I think it was which baseball team he supports? And he almost instantly replied, the Sox. So I imagine that he's very relatable for a lot of Americans, but not just for Americans, as you say. Obviously, his native language is English. And the same with Bishop Barron. I think that there are certain people within the Catholic Church, Word on Fire is an amazing example of this, who are a beacon of light and of preaching the gospel to people who are not Catholics. Myself, I'm an Anglican, but I love listening to the Word on Fire podcast. And I think a lot of people look to people like Bishop Barron and increasingly looking to certain figures within the Catholic Church. Is that something that, is in your view as very much in the spirit of St. Maximilian Kolbe, using the media to evangelize? Do you have in mind those outside of the Catholic community? Are you thinking about the fact that you're reaching so many people who, either they're not Catholics or maybe they're not even necessarily considering becoming Catholics?
Yeah, so we in Word on Fire talk about the via pulchritudinis, which means the way of beauty. There's something of, sometimes when you're talking about truth, people can say, if you say something is true, or you say like, oh, that's just true for me, but not true for you. And, people can react against it. And the same way with the good, you say like, this is the right way to live, or this is a good thing to be doing. Again, it can, cause annoyance or reactance. But, our conviction has always been, and Bishop Barron speaks about this, that beauty, there's something different about the objectively beautiful to kind of pierce into your soul. So I had a friend recently who, he was non-religious and went to Gaudi's masterpiece in Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, and he just said something of the experience of going into this, this beautiful cathedral. He said, God must exist. That's a kind of dramatic example, but something of the way that like we were speaking before, these experiences, these moments, whether it's kind of the liturgy of the Queen's funeral, the most televised event in human history, or the conclave, just something of the the ritual and the elements and stuff to pierce the soul. It's objectively beautiful. It doesn't matter who you are. You might not like it, but you have to admit there's a profound beauty to it. To go in and to rearrange who we are, or to speak into who we are. So I think that beauty has to be part of the 21st century way of engaging people in religion. We've got to, we don't want to force anybody, but it's an invitation to say, to come and see, like Jesus said to the very first disciples, come and see. And something of this, what is the culture that created beautiful rituals, art, architecture, civilization like this? Where did it come from to come to the wellspring of this, and in it to find something to water the roots of your soul?
I think we're seeing a lot of people who are trying to quench their thirst and finding Christianity, and particularly Catholicism, in the process. So thank you so much, Brenden Thompson, for your time. Do check out the Word on Fire podcast, and please like, subscribe, let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching GBN Originals.